Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. As per usual, I'm your host, Steve Pally, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Professor Galen Jackson. How you doing, Galen?
All right, man. We're, like a quarter of the way through the winter. So only another 5 months to go.
That's interesting. I'm looking out the window and it is sunny and about 75 degrees. So I would like to bottle that up and send it to you, but that doesn't seem possible, does it?
You win, as we've discussed at length. So
I guess you don't have to deal with traffic though. So
that's true. That is one thing that living in the middle of nowhere does afford.
yeah. Speaking of traffic, we've been starting to see some traffic to our YouTube channel, which is great. Keep it coming. I always forget to say like, subscribe, and share to our stuff, even if you disagree with us. And a lot of people on YouTube do disagree with us. That's totally fine. We're happy to engage with any civil commenters. And I think that's actually a really important part of what we'd like to do is have those conversations because again, we're educating ourselves while we're trying to educate everybody else. And I'm interested in diverse viewpoints.
Yeah,
Yeah,
man. This stuff, it's not easy. What's
it is not easy.
was it? I'm gonna mess it up, but if it wasn't Einstein, someone correct me. But I think it was the quote was God gave physics all the easy problems. So
Totally. That's pretty definitive. Social science, not so much. All of it's open to interpretation.
trying to prevent World War III. It's more of
Yeah.
an art.
And reasonable people can disagree. So as long as you're reasonable, feel free to disagree. And we like that. Anyway, this week we're going to get away from our detour to the national security strategy over the last few weeks and go back to what we were supposed to be doing, which was examining the China-Japan relationship in a little more detail as a result of an incident that took place well over a month ago now.
I think it was early November.
Yeah, we've got a new prime minister over in Japan, and she is a member of the Liberal Democratic Party. She's a she. Her name is Sanae Takaichi. And this means that Japan joins the club of countries that have achieved female heads of state for the United States. And Japan's a big one because that was not on my bingo card necessarily. Japan's fairly patriarchal, but here we are. Now, Sanae Takaichi is an interesting person. She has an interesting background. She's in her 60s. She is very much not a feminist. She's a traditionalist and she is a conservative, rock-ribbed conservative. She's a member of the LDP's conservative faction from the Shinzo Abe school of thought, which is basically Japanese nationalism. So she's a nationalist, said some interesting stuff about Taiwan. And here's what she said. She said that a Chinese attack or blockade of Taiwan could be a quote unquote survival threatening situation for Japan. And that particular language, that particular formulation is very significant because for reasons we'll get into, Japan has a strange relationship with security and war. And in particular, it doesn't fight any wars anymore, not since the end of World War II. And there's a lot of historical reasons for that. But it has what's called a peace constitution that forbids offensive operations. And that is still the case. However, starting about 10 years ago, during I believe, the Abe administration, they started to inch away from forswearing military force completely and establish some guardrails around certain scenarios whereby Japan could participate in collective defense scenarios. So they can't do anything by themselves. They can only operate in concert with the United States. And the US has bases all over Japan, major military bases, including a major Marine base on Okinawa. But if there's a situation that threatens the survival of the Japanese state, and there are no other alternatives diplomatically or any other way, then by law, Japan is now allowed to participate in joint combat operations for collective defense, meaning with the United States. And it is now Japanese policy, as expressed by PM Takaichi, that a attack or blockade of Taiwan could invoke that particular formulation. That is a very big deal for reasons we'll get into. China did not respond well to this, right, Galen?
No, what's the term people are using now? Crashing out.
Crashing out. Yes. That's my son likes to use that on me. He's like, "Dad, you're crashing out," when he does
Right.
something that really pisses me off and I fly off the handle a little bit. Yeah.
I'm also now in keeping with, some of the vernacular attaching the word adjacent to everything. So it was like crashing out adjacent. They did stuff like warned Chinese tourists from going to Japan. I think they restricted imports on certain Japanese food, particularly seafood. They canceled performances by some Japanese entertainers who had been scheduled to appear in China. And they kind of upped what's known as gray zone tactics, which is like sort of probing what another country's red lines are with sort of low level asymmetric stuff like buzzing airspaces, increasing Coast Guard provocations. They did some more of that around the Senkakus or in
Hmm.
China, the Diabu Islands, which are contested islands. They also, reached out to Japan's main allies. They reached out to some key European countries, first of all, to France and Britain, who are, China's sort of concerned they might be leaning toward Taiwan. My understanding is they're having a bit of a hard time with the Europeans right now because China has been one of Russia's main supporters
Hmm.
in the war in Ukraine. They're also not terribly happy with China's weaponization of its stranglehold over rare earth mineral supplies. They also reached out to President Trump. So she had a phone call with Trump that I think lasted about a half hour, um, saying something to the effect of, China has real interests when it comes to Taiwan, sort of appealing to the idea that China and the United States had to manage jointly world order and asking Trump to basically restrain Japan. So Trump did call Takaichi, did not ask her to disavow the comments.
Hmm.
But basically, what I took away from it was told Japan kind of to chill. And the analysis I saw was something on the order of Japan found that a little unsettling that, Trump might be prioritizing America's relations with China at the moment. And the fact that he spoke to Xi before he spoke to Japanese government officials was seen as potentially significant. So,
Yep.
uh, yeah, China's reaction was pretty strong.
Pretty strong as these things go. And yeah, this happens a lot now. They reach for all these different levers across economics, across culture, across diplomacy, across media. They have like all of these buttons that they push now. And it's like this concerted response that's like Wolf Warrior type stuff. I've heard it called in the past. Now, Wolf
Yeah.
Warrior is like a Chinese action film franchise. I've actually watched one of them. It's always interesting to see the Americans in the place of the bad guy. But these are like 80s stupid action movie franchises with the Chinese in the hero's position. Kind of interesting. The Wolf Warrior series, and this is called Wolf Warrior diplomacy. It's very robust, very aggressive, right?
I knew of the term. I'll have to defer to you on the origins of it. That I was unaware of.
Yeah, the one I saw had Frank Grillo as a like a nasty, arrogant American mercenary as like the bad guy. And yeah, I wouldn't say I recommend it, but it's not bad. Yeah. So notably, Prime Minister Takaichi did not retract her remarks. She did definitely reaffirm Japan's policy of understanding and respecting Beijing's one China stance,
Yeah.
which was established in, I think, 1972. And Japan's been saying this more or less the same thing since then. We have all these different ways from all these different countries of basically invoking the status quo. So, in the national security strategy, for instance, the Trump administration has said that they do not support any unilateral changes to Taiwan's status from either side. Japan says that they understand and respect Beijing's one China stance. Taiwan, a little bit more ambiguous with the Democratic People's Party in charge, but they haven't made a play for independence. I think the only non-status quo power now when it comes to Taiwan status is actually China. And that's kind of where the issue comes from, right, Galen?
Yeah. I mean, the other element here, well, we could debate how long China has wanted to revise the status quo in East Asia,
Yeah.
potentially You could argue since 1949, it has been a revisionist power, but as we have alluded to previously on the show, it's now moving into a position where some people think it might actually be able to do something about it.
Yep.
And so there's the rub. The other thing we should mention is, and this was just reported either yesterday or this morning, is the Trump administration has asked Congress to approve $11 billion in arms sales to Taiwan,
Spicy.
including some major stuff like HIMARS, which have, been played a big role in the Ukraine war.
Yep.
So that's a major arms sale. So there's just some very interesting geopolitical dynamics at play here, particularly for the United States. It's like Trump, obviously, it seems like he's looking to de-escalate matters, at least in the economic sphere with China. It seems like the goal is to walk back the trade war a bit. At the same time, we just talked, in our two-parter on the national security strategy that Taiwan was listed as a major U.S. interest.
Hmm.
It just made an arms sale to Taiwan. It seems to care about the security of Taiwan. It also is looking to reassure its allies, including Japan, while at the same time restraining them, which is a tough needle to thread. So
Absolutely.
a lot of interesting dynamics in terms of how that's going to run its course.
Yeah. A lot of threads, a lot of ins and outs in the
Yeah.
old duder's head, to quote a movie I like. A lot of balls in the air.
Oh, right. A lot of ins, a lot of outs, a lot of what
Yeah.
happens. Yeah.
A lot of what have yous. Exactly. Now, China, I think, was especially upset with what Japan had to say recently because of the fraught historical relationship between these two countries, which has played out over literally thousands of years. But especially the more recent history in 20th century and even 19th century history between these two has been ugly, right, Galen? And so I think providing that context would be helpful for our watchers and listeners. You want to go
Yeah,
for it?
as we've become accustomed to do, it's going to be summarizing like 150 to 200 years of history and like a
But you're so good at it.
reasonable people can disagree about that, man. Yeah, I mean, I think there's like two things accounting for the severity of China's reaction. One is just Japan is a potentially major power, as we have
Yep.
discussed. And if it decides to really drastically rearm itself and increase defense spending, that would be kind of the worst possible manifestation of the rise of a counterbalancing coalition in East Asia.
Sneak peek, Japan has decided to rearm itself. So
Yeah.
we'll get into that next.
China has been looking to avoid that sort of response. Japan, I would argue regionally, is probably the country best positioned to do that. So this is a manifestation of something China really doesn't want to see. But as you alluded to, I think it was especially forceful because it is Japan and the nature of the history between these two countries. So if you want to sort of start the story, you could begin with the Meiji Restoration in the 1860s in Japan, which is sort of seen as the time when the country is put on a modernization footing. And within 3 decades, Japan fights a war with China against the Qing dynasty, the ruling dynasty at the time, and decisively wins that war and leads to something called the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, which is kind of a humiliating treaty for China for a whole bunch of reasons. But particularly important for today is one of the provisions in that treaty is that China hands Taiwan over to Japan.
Then called Formosa, right?
At the time, yeah, known as
Yeah.
Formosa. That is still seen as a major stinging episode by China today. Even at the time, like that sort of discredits the Qing dynasty, which collapses within 2 decades after that. And that's, seen as a seminal event in the century of humiliation when China was exploited by foreign powers. I think things ramp up even more, though, starting in the 1930s and during World War II, of Japan's military behavior during that conflict. So the main highlights here, at least as regards China and Japan, are things like the Nanjing Massacre in 1937. So this month actually is one of the anniversaries of that event, which leads to like widespread civilian casualties, extremely brutal. And then things like Japan's Unit 731, which was a biological warfare unit that did really awful stuff in China. So this unit did things like inject people with bubonic plague or expose them to anthrax or do things like vivisection, which is basically like operating on humans without anesthesia. So like really horrific stuff. Um, this has been an issue between the two countries ever since then. And Takaichi, we should say, is known as a relative hawk.
Yep.
And, in China's eyes, they allege that she has, said and done some things that are problematic in not owning up to Japan's wartime atrocities. I think she visited a shrine that China regards as honoring war criminals from that period.
I
Uh,
think most of Japan's PMs have done that. So we should note that.
yeah, I mean, I'd have to check, but that might be the case. But in any
Yeah,
case, China really doesn't like
they don't.
when Japanese officials do these things. And so I think there's a special context that we need to know when it comes to Chinese Japanese relations, that those wounds have never really healed.
I think thanks for providing that context. And yeah, like I think the best way to describe Japan's actions in China during World War II is Nazi-like behavior. It was predation on a large scale. World War II started much earlier in East Asia than it did in Europe. And so the Chinese had to contend with, I think, 10 to 15 years of Japanese predation.
I think Japan invades Manchuria in 1931. So yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Close to 15 years worth of just genocidal behavior. They detached the entire north of the country and turned it into a puppet state. Obviously, all the massacres, the medical experiments, just extremely nasty
And this
stuff.
is during a time when China is particularly weak. This is during this like warlord period.
Yep.
So, today China sees that as exploiting it when it was particularly weak. Yeah, I make this point when I teach classes on the decision to drop the atomic bombs. There's a famous book by Michael Walzer, one of the celebrated theorists of just war theory,
Mhm.
where he's basically making the case like, if you had wanted to drop the bombs on Nazi Germany, that would have been one thing. But Japan, I think the phrase he uses was engaged in a more ordinary sort of expansion or something like that. It's like you dig into
Mm,
what Japan was actually doing in the region, and you can see why, many people in the area today do not buy that argument at all.
they don't. And I should also note that it's not just the Chinese that remember Japanese
No,
behavior. The Koreans remember it, the Taiwanese remember it, the Filipinos remember it, and the
it,
Indonesians.
Indochina.
Yep, Indonesians, Vietnamese, like you name it. However, what we will say is the Japanese paid as a result of this. And in fact, the United States came in and basically wiped out the Japanese government. They left the emperor, wiped out everything else, took over the country's affairs. Douglas MacArthur was the quote unquote white shogun for 4 years and basically ran the government as a dictator
Yeah, he was
after World War
basically
II.
the emperor of Japan.
Yes, he basically stood next to the emperor and
Yeah.
told the emperor what to do for 4 years. And then the Americans left, but they endowed Japan with the peace constitution, right? Which limited Japan to a small military force called the Self-Defense Forces. It is not the Japanese armed forces, it is the Self-Defense Forces, and it still is. And I believe they were disallowed from ever spending more than 1%.
That's okay. That was the number I thought as well. I thought
Yeah,
1% of GDP capped for defense spending. Yeah.
exactly. That has changed as a result of the 2015 legislation. The Japanese are now headed towards 2%. We'll talk about why that's a really big deal. But yeah, it's the context here is everything. I think it really is because the shoe is now on the other foot. The Chinese are very much ascendant. And, it's not like the history doesn't matter, but everybody is now looking at China, not Japan. And that includes Japan because, as we said, the prime minister thinks that this could be a state threatening situation if they were to lose an independent Taiwan. Here's why. Japan imports a lot of really important stuff, in particular oil. And most of that oil, I think the vast majority, goes through the Taiwan Strait. In addition, Japan has islands, including an island, like an island chain that extends to the southwest from the south of Japan. Okinawa is one of those islands, but there's more. So there's actual Japanese territory within, I believe, 50 miles of Taiwan, and on the northeast side of Taiwan.
Yeah.
So
And just to like flesh this out a bit, I mean, Japan has always been very worried about its energy supplies.
Mhm.
You know, if you study the road to war, which I know you have between the United States and Japan in 1941,
Mhm.
arguably the key precipitating event is the United States imposing an oil embargo on
Excellent
Japan.
point. Yep.
And that's a major inflection point that ultimately leads to Pearl Harbor 6 months later or so. The United States government was extremely worried about Japan shifting its position politically after the 1973 Middle East war, which led to Arab oil embargo and, more importantly, production cuts. This is a country that has next to no indigenous sources of energy. And, since the 2011 meltdown at Fukushima, Japan has a
Mm.
very robust nuclear infrastructure, but like Germany, really scaled that back as a result of that incident. And so highly dependent on imported energy, much of which, as you said, runs through these critical sea lines.
Yep. So basically, if China wanted to, if they had control of Taiwan, they could shut down those trade routes and basically bring Japan to its knees, more or less overnight. So, to whatever extent the United States considers Taiwanese independence a national interest, Japan has, I think, a much stronger case.
Yeah. Can I also, I mean,
Yeah.
aside from, we've talked about this before, but like the credibility of alliance commitments, right? Like,
Hmm.
even if the United States doesn't have an ironclad security commitment to Taiwan, many people view it as having a commitment because the relationship is so long standing. So for the US to not intervene would be bad news for Japan, even if
Yep.
it's for the sake of Taiwan. And the other issue is like, we don't have to go into this now. There's all sorts of other strategic reasons that Japan, anyone else in the area in the United States believe preserving the integrity of this first island chain of which Taiwan is a part is really important. I'll suffice it to say for now, there's a really good article from Brendan Green, who we had on the show. He
Oh, yeah.
co-authored it with Caitlin Talmadge. There's one version of it in international security if you're really looking to nerd out, and a shorter version in foreign affairs, where they talk about like if China were able to leverage Taiwan and take its deep water ports on the eastern side, it would be in a much better position to project power, to project intelligence assets outward to the east. That obviously would be a major problem for Japan as well as the United States.
Yeah, to a certain extent, if China takes Taiwan successfully, it kind of gets Japan and maybe the Philippines as a bonus almost in terms of their ability to coerce those countries. And so that's extremely problematic.
I'm still thinking about that. Like, there is this part of me that's like, you see these arguments. It's this one island goes and like the whole defense posture collapses. Like,
Yeah.
I do have some inherent skepticism, but to your point, like, there are very smart people that make precisely that argument. So
Yeah.
the stakes are high, regardless of where you come down on that question.
Totally. And so let's talk about what Japan is doing concretely, other than saying that Taiwanese independence is a vital national interest, which I think it very obviously is to
Yeah.
anybody who knows anything about like the oil trade and Japanese resource vulnerability. So during our great power draft earlier in the year, I think I picked Japan number 3. You picked Russia.
You got a better memory of that than I do. I think I had India number 3.
Oh, you did have India. Yeah. Yeah. I'm pretty sure I picked Japan. Here's why. So Japan is not growing, it's actually shrinking in terms of population. I don't think it's really growing economically so much, and it hasn't for several decades at this point.
The lost decades, man.
Yeah. But guess what? It still has a $4 to $5 trillion economy.
And I think the population is still like 120 million people, something like
Plenty of
that.
people,
Let me
plenty of
check.
money, and world class technological infrastructure. So this means that even a 1% limitation on its defense budget in terms of GDP is pretty big. It's actually pretty big. And now they're headed towards 2%. When they get to 2%, they'll basically be into the $100 billion a year territory, which is probably half the way to what China spends, maybe a third, between a third and a half. It'll be pretty close to what Russia spends in the middle of the Ukraine war. Not only that, Japan has preferred access to the very best US military hardware. So they have F-35s, which is, I think, the US's most sophisticated fighter and strike aircraft. And they're not the only ones, but they just bought 100 more, which would give it 150 F-35s, making it number 2 behind the United States in terms of the number of F-35s deployed. They also have Tomahawk missiles, which is, I think, the premier long-range, air-to-ground or ground-to-ground strike package in terms of accuracy, in terms of strike power.
We just saw this in debates over Ukraine,
Yeah.
what a big deal would be if the Ukrainians got those. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it bought another 400 Tomahawks, which is a huge number. So when those deliveries come through, Japan will have the number 2 US style strike package behind the United States. It'll be in front of Australia. It'll be in front of the UK and any other US ally. And that is quite significant when you're thinking about the ability to defeat a Taiwanese invasion, right?
Yeah,
They'll be right. They'll be right there.
Feel like that happened on the down low, man. I didn't.
Yeah, it's a big deal, right? It's basically a mini US right off the coast of Taiwan. It's right there. Plus, it's full of US military bases and this chain of islands that they're busy fortifying and putting radars on. They're also training their own brigade of Marines to come onto islands and fight and take over islands if they've been invaded. So they are basically getting ready for a conflict over Taiwan, and they're getting ready in a way that is extremely threatening to Chinese interests, especially when you combine it with the United States and Taiwan. Taiwan just bought $11 billion worth of HIMARS and howitzers. That's long-range precision ground-to-ground strike. HIMARS can be used to attack the staging areas in China for an invasion.
Yeah, it
Meanwhile,
certainly seems to be like in keeping with this idea of turning Taiwan into a porcupine, right?
totally.
Like making an assault on the island extremely costly, even if
Yeah.
it ultimately succeeds. Yeah.
And then you add in Japanese capabilities, those fortified islands from which they can launch, air sorties or Tomahawk cruise missiles. And that's before you even get to the United States with its carrier groups and everything. So it's like, man, that's a lot of capability. And if I'm China and I'm looking at this, it makes my job a lot harder. In fact, it makes it so hard that you'd have to be pretty risk acceptant to want to go after this. Now, I don't think it's a guarantee that the Japanese would get involved automatically. They might just allow US staging.
You had some interesting public opinion data from Japan on that.
I did. Yeah. So the Japanese are fairly closely divided in terms of public opinion when it comes to participating in a potential war over Taiwan. If it is in context of going in with the United States, then I think it's close to a majority in favor. And I think the Chinese have an interest in driving that down. Remains to be seen whether they'll be able to do that and if they'll choose the right approach. Because the Chinese basically have one approach, which is very aggressive and threatening, seemingly. And I think that drives the percentage up, not down. However, if the US were to stay out of a Taiwan conflict, the Japanese public, as of right now, would not support unilateral action to preserve Taiwanese independence. And in fact, I don't think they'd be able to do it necessarily under their national security law. So
I agree with that. I also think as a matter of capabilities, they probably couldn't hold off an invasion, although I think regardless, it would be
challenging.
Fairly bloody endeavor on China's part. I mean, we're seeing the historical context really play an important role here. Like, I guess I'll have to make a second Big Lebowski reference. Like, pacifism is not something to hide behind, dude. No, but there is this historical legacy of pacifism for the reasons we discussed in the post-World War II period, where
Yeah.
it is a peace constitution. You see this today with debates over whether Japan should get nuclear weapons for very obvious reasons. There's significant anti-nuclear sentiment in that country still.
Yeah.
Um, so I guess I didn't find that statistic as surprising that most Japanese people would not want to get involved for the sake of Taiwan without US intervention. I found it quite interesting that it was basically 50-50, right? Even if the United States were to be involved, was roughly the data you had.
Yeah, I think we're coming from a context of the Japanese impulse towards pacifism after the early 20th century being very real because they got atom bombed and occupied and,
And
just
and before the atom bombings, firebombed, which
yeah,
was really horrific stuff as well.
yeah, as bad or worse, the firebombing of Tokyo in terms of like raw casualties, I think.
Something like over 60 Japanese cities, more than 50% of the cities were destroyed
Yeah.
prior to the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs.
Like Germany, they really had to start from scratch. Unlike Germany, they were not divided into East Germany and West Germany. That didn't happen to Japan, but it did lose a lot of territory, particularly to the Russians in the north. And they were occupied and turned into a democracy, the US, albeit a democracy that was a single party state for decades and still largely is. But yeah, so they had a total like brain and personality transplant. And I think that legacy is still, very much in place. But history doesn't stop, which is why we're doing this podcast, right? So things are changing. The Japanese are watching and they're not, letting the grass grow under their feet, so to speak.
Yeah, and I don't see a world in which Takeichi walks these comments back fully, aside from the fact that Trump did not demand that she do that. It was a little ambiguous, but I basically took away was like, maybe chill out, like don't be so public about this. She's a hawkish prime minister, like she has a certain domestic interest in
Yeah.
maintaining this posture and very legitimate national security concerns for the reasons you laid out. If the first island chain is compromised, or if Japan cannot rely on US support in the event that China really starts throwing its weight around in East Asia, Japan is in a vulnerable spot, which I guess leaves us, as always, with the big question of like, where do we go from here?
Yeah. So we go to 2027, which is when she has set a goal to be able to take Taiwan by force. And like,
And I think the wording on that is not like we're going to do it then.
no,
The
we'll have the
PLA
capability.
needs to be prepared by then to be able to do it or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would imagine those arms deliveries are going to arrive by then to both Taiwan and Japan. So Japan will have this crazy US grade strike package of F-35s and Tomahawks by then. Taiwan will have HIMARS and US grade artillery. And I don't know what the United States will be doing in 2027. Trump will still be in charge. So I suppose like anything is possible. But the current national security strategy says, in no uncertain terms, we do not support any unilateral changes to the status quo. The US is a status quo power. Taiwan, you know, like public opinion wants independence in Taiwan, but in terms of like declared policy, it's a status quo power. Japan would invoke national security to preserve the status quo. The only non-status quo power at this party is China. So the ball is going to be in China's court, which is what we said last week as regards the Taiwan situation. And it comes down to what Xi Jinping is going to want to do. Now, he could start with a blockade. He wouldn't necessarily need to or want to start Taiwan conflict with a full-on invasion. A blockade would put the ball back in the allied court, so the Japanese and US and Taiwanese court. And a blockade would start some kind of timer countdown whereby Taiwan runs out of resources. So they would basically be daring the allies to respond in some way. I just said that Japan has the islands within, I think, 50 miles of Taiwan. So that could be a flashpoint right there because blockade would surround the entire island, including the 50 miles of ocean in between these Japanese island and the northeast coast of Taiwan. So that's one thing we could see. And it might escalate from there. But I don't think anybody knows what Xi Jinping is planning.
No, I mean, isn't that the rub? Like, I think the best I can do as sort of an outside analyst is speculate and say starting a war would be extremely risky. And
Yeah.
we're talking potentially about World War III. Like, even if it goes well, I think it's going to be a very costly endeavor for them. On the other
Absolutely.
hand, like, this is what wars are made out of. Like,
Yep.
irresolvable core political disputes, particularly ones that hit on things like national identity, territory, like rising great power ambition. Like,
Yep.
I don't have a good answer or sense of what China will decide to do here, but I do, I go back and forth sometimes on where I think the most quote unquote most dangerous place in the world is. I think right now it's probably the Taiwan Straits.
Yeah. Like this would be a much bigger war. There's also wild cards on China's side. There's the North Koreans and the Russians,
Yeah.
which we would be remiss not to talk about those guys. The North
No, I
Koreans,
mean, we're talking about a region, if you count the United States as a player, which obviously you should, that's four nuclear powers right there.
yeah, yeah. I would imagine that a Taiwan crisis that devolves into a shooting war, something might kick off on the Korean Peninsula. There'd be a pretty decent chance. So, we'd have to deal with that too. And then the Russians are currently occupied in Ukraine. They may or may not be occupied by 2027. It's hard to say. I think all bets are off in terms of like there's a peace process now, but whether or not they're serious about peace and on whose terms, it's hard to say. And I also don't know how much capability the Russians have in the Far East, but it's not zero. I know that. And to your point, they are definitely a nuclear power.
Yeah. And, we've already done an episode on this, so I won't belabor the point, but like, this is why the whole question of Japan and South Korea nuclearizing is like so top of mind. And you're seeing increasingly more people make that argument, or at least I think even Colby in his book said like that's not a bad fallback option. Like he'd
Yeah.
prefer for that not to be the case, but like some allied proliferation might. You're also seeing arguments to threaten it, if to try to restrain China, those countries getting the bomb would be kind of China's nightmare.
Yep.
There was recently discussions between the United States and South Korea. I think the US and South Korea have a treaty going back to like the 70s where South Korea is not supposed to enrich uranium or reprocess plutonium indigenously, but like that could change, and South Korea has a pretty robust nuclear infrastructure. So I think that's another thing people are watching pretty closely right now, depending
Yeah.
on where US policy goes. And, we're speculating about other countries' policy. I feel like the US might be as much of a wild card in terms of what it's going to do as anyone at this point. My sense from going back to earlier in the year when we talked about this was Trump said something to the effect of like, I don't want to have to make this choice between surrender and World War III. And we were both like, we understand why
I get it.
that's a rough choice. And the national security strategy is like sort of clarifying, but also ambiguous. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So here's what I think. I think that the US plus Japan plus Taiwan versus China in 2027, that probably favors the allies and not China. It's not to say that China couldn't or wouldn't win, but I think it would be an uphill slog for sure. Minus the US, China probably wins if it
I think
wants to.
I think that's right.
Yeah. So a lot comes down to what the United States does or doesn't do. Now, if Trump is still in charge in 2027 and like it'll be the third year of his term, but he's old, right? Trump is unpredictable. Like something's written in his national security strategy, but like in terms of what he actually does or doesn't do,
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I honestly don't know. He's perfectly willing to sell arms to the Taiwanese, but he also has this isolationist instinct and seemingly cares a lot more about the Western Hemisphere or at least people in his administration do. It's hard to say. He's talked a lot more about the Western Hemisphere. If you
Look,
just look at what he has said, right? Now, if he is out of the picture for health reasons or for other reasons, you have President Vance, most likely. Vance is known to be an isolationist, like a straight up isolationist. And so I think in that eventuality, under a Vance administration, it's probably less likely that the US would intervene in a Taiwan conflict. But again, I don't really know. So,
no, and I'm not even going to try to get like. By the way, I have a certain respect for that argument. Like,
mhm.
as significant as this area is, and even if you believe some of the more, some of the grimmer outcomes if China succeeds in doing this, like, there's a certain logic to like maybe arm the Taiwanese, maybe try to bolster your allies somewhat. I guess you could try to get South Korea and Japan to cooperate more, but that's been failing for decades now for similar reasons that Japan and China don't get along. But, if the alternative is World War III breaking out, like there's a powerful argument to maybe going the porcupine strategy. Like we're talking about
Okay.
extremely risky things here.
Yeah, it's very risky, but keep in mind that South Korea and Japan are both formal treaty allies
Yep,
of the US. And so the
correct.
US, I think, is obligated to come to their aid in the event of a wartime situation
And those
between
are
those
like
countries and China.
congressionally backed formal
Yes.
security alliances.
And
Yeah.
look, there's ways to like square that circle and call something what a militarized police action or whatever, right? You can define your way out of it, but then, like your treaties become worthless. Maybe you don't care because you're isolationist. I think that if big questions start to get raised in those countries about US commitments, then they do dash for nuclear bomb, and maybe World War III starts there as part of a preventive strike on the part of the Chinese. Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, for that matter, all three of them could get the bomb probably inside of 6 months if they wanted to, maybe faster.
Japan, my understanding for sure. South Korea, I think, has 26 nuclear reactors.
Yeah.
And South Korea and Taiwan both had nuclear programs during the Cold War, which
Yep.
the United States stopped. So they've shown themselves to be interested in that option. I think for now, South Korea is probably the one most interested in that,
Yep.
um,
For obvious reasons. They're
based on
facing
the
down the North
reporting.
Koreans. Yeah, the North Koreans who were not mentioned at all in the national security strategy, by the way, which we should have remarked on. Like, that's a big deal for the South Koreans. It's like, we're just not thinking about that at all. Like, not even to say that it's not important. It's like a non issue for the US at the moment. It's a big issue for them. And so I think if I'm China, I'm watching these guys make a mad dash for the bomb, then I very strongly consider preemptive strike, take out those facilities if I can find them. So that's
Wouldn't be the first time this year that we saw that happen. So.
yeah, that's right. We did it to Iran. So yeah, lots of uncertainty, but this area of the world is fraught and it's only getting crazier. Let's put it that way. So I don't know. It could be a new global tantrum, really.
Good. What we need
Yeah,
is more uncertainty.
absolutely. Yeah, that's what I need.
Yeah.
All right, let's leave it there for this week. As always, thanks for the excellent session, Galen,
You too,
and
man.
we'll see you all next time.